Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the second lecture in the Roanoke College Memorials, Monuments, and Memory Lecture Series. My name is Justine Ludwig, and I am the Executive Director of Creative Time, a public arts organization that works with artists to contribute to the dialogues, debates, and dreams of our times. Sponsored by the Center for Studying Structures of Race at Roanoke College and co-presented by Creative Time, the Memorials, Monuments, and Memory Lecture Series brings to Roanoke's campus a number of artists, architects, and scholars whose work addresses the role of monuments and memorials in society. Presented in tandem this spring INQ 300 capstone course by the same name, the series invites students and the public to examine the intersection of art, public memory, and history. The series also precedes planning for the school's commission of a new memorial commemorating the enslaved persons who built the college and contributed to the wider region. The memorial will be developed and presented jointly by the college and Creative Time. I'd like to thank Jessie Bucher, Director for the study of the Center for Studying Structures of Race at Roanoke College, and Lacey Leonard, Assistant Gallery Director at the college, for the time and effort they've devoted to bringing this series to fruition. 2 weeks ago, we opened this series with a lecture from conceptual artist Charles Gaines, who spoke on how the language of the monument and monumental sculpture manifests in his practice to interrogate the paradoxical legacy of American prosperity. Now, without further ado, I would like to give a warm welcome to tonight's speaker, Mabel O. Wilson, a cultural historian, architectural designer, and curator. Wilson teaches architecture and Black studies at Columbia University, where she also serves as the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies. With her practice studio and she was a member of the design team that recently completed the memorial to enslaved laborers at the University of Virginia. Wilson is also the author of Begin with the Past, Building the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Negro Building, Black Americans in the World of Fairs and Museums, and the co-editor of the volume, Race and Modern Architecture from Enlightenment to Today. She's a founding member of Who Builds Your Architecture, an advocacy project to educate the architectural profession about the problems of globalization and labor, and the co-host of the podcast Black Lives in the Era of COVID-19, a close look at the impact of the virus on New York communities. For the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, she was the co-curator of the 2021 exhibition, Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America. A quick note about tonight's program before I hand the mic over to Mabel. At the conclusion of the program, Mabel will answer questions moderated by Jessie. To take part, please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. Mabel, thank you for your presence tonight and for continuing the lecture series with us today. I'll pass the mic over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Justine, for your very generous introduction. And let me just pull up my presentation and we can get started. So hopefully everyone can see that, my opening slide. But I just want to thank everyone at Roanoke College for the invitation to really contribute to this important conversation about monuments and memorial, and also to Creative Time for all of their support, particularly DJV, Natasha Logan, Lizzie Smith. And also I'm really looking forward to speaking with Jessie in the Q&A with Justine about memorials and monuments, because working, just in reflection, and that's really what in part this lecture is, I think there are challenges when, creating a memorial from an archive of slavery. And I think that's part of what I want to address with this question of, can we forget? So 2 years after emancipation and the end of the Civil War, Isabella Gibbons, a school teacher at the newly created Freedman School in Charlottesville, Virginia, penned a letter in the March issue of the Boston-based monthly, the Freedman's Record. In her short but informative letter, Gibbons provided a forceful corrective to white Southerners' projection that their former holdings in human property enslaved families like Gibbons, her husband William, and their children, thought of their former masters and mistresses with great affection and even longing. Gibbons noted that white Southerners believed that Yankees were turning newly emancipated African Americans against them, even though from their perspective, many of their former slaves harbored no ill will. So in her letter, Gibbons mined these former enslavers' grandiose misperceptions, writing, quote, "Most of them love us and have forgotten what happened while they were slaves. They know we are their friends," end quote. So in the letter, it was really Gibbons' mission to put what she labeled as a grand story to rest by recounting her and her community's recollection of enslavement. And in the letter, this is what she remembers. Quote, "Can we forget the crack of the whip, cowhide, whipping post, the auction block, the handcuffs, the spaniels, the iron collar, the Negro trader tearing the young child from its mother's breast as a whelp from the lioness? Have we forgotten that by these horrible cruelties, hundreds of our race have been killed? No, we have not, or ever will," end quote. Now, Gibbons probably recognized all too well that white supremacy had not retreated in the Piedmont nor elsewhere in the South. She had witnessed how her fellow Southern citizens were whitewashing history by conjuring a noble lost cause while obstructing the progress of reconstructions, siphoning off all monetary and material aid, and impeding the black franchise at the ballot box. And in fact, how white Southerners were constituting a new regime of racial violence out of the remnants of slavery's tactics of deadly intimidation appeared in the letter printed just above Gibbons in the Freedmen's Record, in which a white teacher, Sidney Busby, recounts how their freedmen's school near Raleigh, North Carolina, was first riddled with bullets and then burned to the ground. And yet, in the face of these obstacles, Gibbons remained committed to educating the children and adults within Charlottesville's Black community as a means of repairing the dehumanizing psychic and material conditions wrought by centuries of enslavement. But there is more to her story. Here we see Gibbons in an undated photograph in the collection of the Boston Public Library. Gibbons learned to read and write while she was enslaved, which made her, once free, an ideal teacher within the Freedmen's School network. As we see here, her dress, with its embellishments, declare her status of a member of a nascent Black middle class. Her hand resting on a book signifies her profession as an educator. It is believed that Gibbons taught herself to read and to write, a skill punishable by beating or even death, after she arrived at the University of Virginia around 1850, when she was purchased by a professor of natural philosophy, William Barton Rogers, who eventually left the school for Boston to be a founder of MIT. She served as the family's cook in Pavilion 6, which is what you see on the right. As real property that could be entailed or sold with the house and the land, Gibbons continued these duties enslaved by other professorial families until she, her husband William, a servant also enslaved by a UVA professor, and their children were emancipated in March of 1865. Now, where Gibbons labored was part of an ensemble of buildings that comprised the University of Virginia. When it opened in 1826, UVA's 10 pavilions housed faculty and family. Its lawn rooms boarded 125 white male students, and the verdant swath of the terrace lawn was crowned by the rotunda, the centerpiece of the ensemble that housed the library. right? This sort of absolutely Platonic spheric form, right? The Enlightenment, right? The sphere that held the promise of the Enlightenment, I think, for Jefferson. Now, in his plans for an academical village, Thomas Jefferson, signer of the Declaration of Independence, the second governor of Virginia, third president of the United States, lawyer, surveyor, plantation owner, and owner of 600 enslaved people over the course of his life, wrote in a letter that a modern American university should bring together an exclusive community and an environment to be conducive, quote, to health, to study, to manners, morals, and order, end quote. And so thus, while in Jefferson's educational Eden, its white residents embarked on a daily journey of personal enlightenment and communal engagement, whose material needs were satisfied by the labor of slaves. For the enslaved, their daily routine unfolded under the regulatory authority of slave codes that severely curtailed mobility and basic freedoms of family and assembly. In his designs for UVA, Jefferson carefully calibrated the vistas throughout the grounds to strategically hide from view the spaces where slaves labored. Slaves like Isabella Gibbons, and her husband William, worked in poorly illuminated kitchens and lived in quarters below the pavilions and eventually behind the pavilions. Behind the pavilions, they worked inside the snaking serpentine walls, where the wash and the smokehouses and other dependencies could be found. The enslaved lived under the constant threat of violence at any time from any white person, faculty, students, hotel owners, university administrators, visitors, on and off grounds that ensured unyielding obedience and compliance. So thus, what had been rendered silent in official historical narratives about the university's antebellum period from 1817 to 1865 was mention of the academical village's dependency on an equal number, roughly 150 at one time, enslaved men, women, and children. That history literally hid in plain sight for 155 years, as seen here in this depiction of an enslaved woman taking care of the white child of a professor on the Widow's Walk of Pavilion 9, rendered in a cartouche from a famous 1827 map of Virginia. As a founding father, shown here with a copy of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson's likeness and accomplishments are remembered in thousands of monuments, could be tens of thousands, quite frankly, around the United States, like this, and actually, in other countries, and are very much like this bronze Beaux-Arts statue that is sited on the north side of the rotunda. A polymath, naturalist, and Enlightenment man of letters, Jefferson understood the power of recollection all too well. Now, when he took stock of the burgeoning nation and his state of Virginia in his 1875 book, Notes on a State of Virginia, he speculated that, quote, deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained, will divide us into parties and produce convulsions which will probably never end, but in the extermination of the one or the other race, end quote. Now, as he outlines in Notes on a State of Virginia, his proposed resolution to this prospect of slave insurrections and white moral decay was the incremental emancipation of America's enslaved population. Once liberated Negroes would be denied citizenship and transported outside of the bounds of the United States to settle in indigenous lands to the west, in the Caribbean, or perhaps in Africa. Now, Jefferson understood from his own life as a slaveholder that the routine violence that maintained submission would never be forgotten by those like Isabella Gibbons they had enslaved. Now, in August of 2017, this statue of Thomas Jefferson became a gathering point for a group of 100 mostly white men, although there were some women in the group, who led a torch-lit parade through the university's historic grounds, an ominous reenactment of Ku Klux Klan night marches. Members of white nationalist groups had descended on Charlottesville to protest the city's government's proposed removal of monuments to Confederate generals Robert E. Lee and Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson. While alternating cries of "You will not replace us," or "Jews will not replace us," and "White Lives Matter," the throngs of white nationalists encircled a smaller group of anti-racist protesters at the base of the Jefferson statue. Jefferson, who in his lifetime had been a vociferous champion of freedom for white Euro-Americans, but had lacked the political and personal will to end chattel slavery, which would have freed thousands of enslaved blacks, including hundreds of his own slaves. He did stop the transnational, the international slave trade, but not the domestic trade in slaves. The statue became a flashpoint for both the condemnation and exaltation of white nationalist ideals constitutive to the nation's founding and prosperities. Now, as a counter-protest to the white supremacist march, 1 month later, in September of 2017, dozens of protesters, a group that included students, faculty, and Charlottesvillians, engaged in an act of civil disobedience by wrapping the figure of Jefferson in a black plastic bag and draping a Black Lives Matter, Fuck White Supremacy banner at the statue's marble base. The demonstration proclaimed solidarity with local residents in response to the violent and deadly white nationalist march that had taken place 1 month earlier and that had left one anti-racist counter-protester, Heather Heyer, dead. Now, what the protesters demanded was for UVA's administration to renounce the institution's historical connections with racist individuals and groups by, for example, removing 2 Confederate memorial plaques affixed to the Rotunda's south entrance. They proclaimed this as a march to reclaim our grounds. Now here we see the Lee statue in downtown Charlottesville as it was surrounded by police in tactical gear in August of 2017. Now many of you know it was finally removed last year. Now from its inception as a nation in the 18th century, white Americans have deployed monuments to territorialize white supremacy through representations of ideal character, ideal physiques, and historical significance. The proliferation of Confederate monuments to a fictive lost cause encapsulates this practice par excellence. To correct the record, we should not call these more than 4,000 plus Confederate monuments. They are, in fact, American monuments reflective of shared values erected by American citizens in America's public spaces. Now, these symbolic expressions of white supremacy in monuments, which in towns like Charlottesville, Virginia, demarcated where Black residents under Jim Crow's prohibitions could or could not venture. These monuments worked in concert with racial assemblages of urban space, substandard housing, segregated public amenities, racial violence, and law enforcement to diminish the prospects of Black lives after Reconstruction. The memorial landscape of Charlottesville provides fertile ground to consider this racialized dynamic in many U.S. cities and towns. The requisite expression of figuration, names, and historical citations of monuments and memorials are deeply entangled in how whiteness historicizes and territorializes its power, one of the many forms of domination that Gibbons so painfully recalls in her recollection of a life enslaved. Therefore, when remembering slavery in places like UVA, how does one reckon with racialized forms of its very addressed, foundational to the Western monument form? Remembering an enslaved community. Toward the nearly impossible task of recollection, reclamation, and repair, Saidiya Hartman writes, quote, "I want to tell a story about two girls capable of retrieving what remains dormant, the purchase or claim of their lives on the present, without committing further violence in my own act of narration. It is a story predicated upon impossibility, listening for the unsaid, translating misconstrued words, and refashioning disfigured lives, and intent on achieving an impossible goal, redressing the violence that produced numbers, ciphers, and fragments of discourse, which is as close as we can come to a biography of the captive and the enslaved," end quote. And this is from her essay, Venus in Two Acts. Now, paraphrasing Hartman, can we retrieve in a memorial for UVA's enslaved community what remains dormant, the purchase or claim of their lives on the present, without committing further violence in our own act of architectural and spatial narration of the past? Now, UVA's history of slavery remained pretty much buried until the 2000s, when student protests at the university demanded that the president, Teresa Sullivan, and the Board of Visitors acknowledge the enslaved community that built and maintained the lives of all those at UVA in the antebellum period. Now, in 2007, UVA's Board of Visitors authorized the installation of a plaque, as seen here, in the floor of the walkway of the rotunda on the south side and the colonnade below, co-equal with recognitions that they had already given to white craftsmen. So it sort of sits parallel with a kind of plaque, recognizing their work of the builders and the craftsmen that worked on the university. However, this plaque had the unintended consequence of sparking student outrage, because many felt that it merely was walked over and not seen, that history remained invisible. And that hidden history became even more tangible to the community when archaeologists discovered 70 unmarked graves a few years later behind the university's official cemetery. And seen here is a ceremony of the memorialization that began in the community of Charlottesville and ended in the cemetery to recognize those lives. And so the community and students pressured the university to do more to honor the lives of this enslaved community. So in 2016, I joined with architects Mijin Yoon, seen here on the left, and then next, Eric Howler. Their firm is Howler Yoon in Boston. We were also joined by landscape architect based in Charlottesville, Greg Bleem. Also, as part of the initial team, conflict mediator, activist, and UVA professor Frank Dukes, to win the commission to design the memorial to enslaved laborers at UVA. Seen here at Montpelier with Frank is the Brooklyn-based artist Eto Otetigbe, who joined our team a year later in 2017. And needless to say, ours was a rich collaboration, an ensemble of designers, artists, and scholars. Now, to engage this fraught commemorative landscape, we not only had to design a memorial, but integral to that process was to design a community engagement process. It included a survey, meetings in community spaces, and community ambassadors to build dialogue, understanding, and trust. And fortunately, we joined an already robust community of educators, students, staff, and community members taking stock of the history of slavery at the university and the Charlottesville region, which included staff and descendant communities of the presidential plantations of Jefferson's Monticello and James Madison's plantation, Montpelier, which has been in the news quite recently. And note, some of the images here are actually at the Jefferson School, which was the segregated school that evolved from Gibbons Freedman School, and also an image at Ebenezer Baptist Church. That's the image at the top left. But we also met with the congregation at Mount Zion churches and various religious leaders in Charlottesville. And we also had meetings with various groups on the campus as well. And we were fortunate to have what was called the President's Commission to Study Slavery at the university, that was formed to really do a deep dive into this history and make it sort of visible through the production of like a walking tour, the naming of buildings, connecting with descendant families, and working with us on the memorial. So the memorial merged with an extensive public dialogue with members of Charlottesville community, and in particular members of the Black community there. We opened dialogue mindful of the history of mistrust and suspicion that many harbored against an institution that many still refer to as the plantation, in part because of its treatment of workers and its incremental gentrification of nearby Black neighborhoods, which elevate the cost of housing above what is affordable by locals. Now, what we heard at our conversation was that the memorial needed to tell the unvarnished truth about the past to have any legitimacy, that it needed to bring the community together to both learn and reflect on that history, and that it needed to express dualities, not only of the pain and the suffering of the enslaved, but also of their resilience, dignity, and humanity. And lastly, it needed to be a living memorial, an ongoing memorial acknowledging that the work of this commemorative landscape remains incomplete in the wake of slavery. Now, in my remaining time, I want to address the problematic of designing and building a monument to an enslaved community, engaging with the archive of slavery in an educational, quote, landscape of tyranny, end quote, as historian Lewis Nelson characterizes antebellum UVA. Now, in our research, we learned that enslaved workers, many of them boys, fabricated and fired the 1.2 million bricks for the rotunda, and that their fingerprints on some of the bricks have left an improbable memorial of their lives and of their labor. And therefore, we believed as a design team that it was important to convey the material presence of Black lives at UVA. And this is in fact reflected in one response to our survey. As a Black American, I feel an internal pride of gazing upon every brick, every pillar, and every garden at the university, and knowing that this fraught path has birthed an undeniably beautiful present. So we must feel beauty, pride, and gratitude. Now, along with collecting aspirations in public forums and online, hearing about desired meanings and experiences and the stories that needed to be told about the memorial, we also researched Black traditions and spaces of gathering. As part of our design process, we looked for cultural forms and rituals that could be translated into our design. Hush harbors, baptismal rituals. We looked at works by people like Alma Thomas and others. We explored, for example, ring shouts, which is a low country, which is the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina, a low island ecstatic dance whose performers move in a circle and whose rhythms and movement connect with Western African practices. So circular forms like the ring shout, a broken shackle, became relevant for us. Now we cited, as you can see here, both in the site plan on the right and then the aerial on the left, we cited the memorial in dialogue with the rotunda. Both have the diameter of 80 feet. Jefferson placed the rotunda at the ridgeline of a hill upon which the university grounds were built. The careful terracing of the lawn, if one were to cut what we call the architectural section, so like imagine running a slice through it, allowed Jefferson to design pavilions that were 2 stories on the lawn side, which we saw in that engraving. But if you look on their back side, they're actually 3 stories on the garden side, which created a lower level walkout basement, which, as I mentioned earlier, housed spaces for the labor of enslaved, like the kitchen where Gibbons labored. Now, these were inside the famous serpentine walls. And they weren't the ornamental gardens that many of you may have seen today, but as I mentioned, they were work yards where the enslaved chopped wood or slaughtered animals and for the smokehouse or watched clothes. And this is important because Jefferson clearly understood slavery to be abhorrent, right? And so he employed architecture and the architectural section to conceal it. And this is much in the same way that he buries the dependencies at Monticello below ground. So you have this sort of pristine vista to, this pastoral landscape beyond, and then the wilderness at Monticello. Right. And so we designed the memorial as a series of nested rings that opens out as opposed to closes off like the rotunda. And it's a series of nested rings fabricated in Virginia mist granite from a nearby quarry in Culpeper, Virginia. And as you can see here at the top of this diagram, the center holds a gathering space, which is then inscribed by an inner ring, which holds a timeline of historical events. The next layer out of the ring creates a concave surface of remembrance, and then the outer convex surface creates an expression for canvas for expression, which is a work by Eto Otatigbe. And so each of these rings speaks to a different layer of history, meaning, and interpretation. The memorial is sited northward, so it's oriented toward the north, and then a path to the left lays out, right, this path of liberation. And so there's a step for each of the 48 years enslaved peoples lived and worked at UVA. Now, to develop the layers of history in the memorial, we worked closely with a really amazing group of committed historians whose thoughtful examination of UVA's enslaved community and their rich history provided incredibly rich material. Now, to name names, to tell the story of the enslaved community required that we engage in an archive of work ledgers, as seen here. You could see on December 29th, extra hands at Christmas, $2.50. And so the archive was of work ledgers and personal letters. And these are exactly the numbers and ciphers, right, that Hartman mentions of slave owners, right? And as such, it is an archive of daily life, one laced with silences and haunted by the violence of enslavement. Now, historians estimate that 4,000 men, women, and children built, labored, and lived at UVA, but we know very little about the details of their lives. How then, and this was the big challenge for the design team, how to represent the unknown unknowns, where archival erasure continued the violence of racial capital's calibration of life turned into a thing. For most of the 3,111 persons to be exact, the archives do not record a first name or a last name, right? And that was because many of the enslaved were in fact rented by the university. As the spreadsheet on the right of this image shows, we found records for 889 persons. Of those 889 references, we know mostly the first name of about 577 community members. For a handful of people like Isabella Gibbons, Sally Cottrell, Thurston Hearn, Henry Martin, we know full names, first and last name, but that was unusual. So for the remaining 311 recorded persons, like 3 extra hands hired at Christmas, we used kinship relationships and occupations to remember their lives. So as you walk into the memorial, you become enveloped by a genealogical cloud of names, marks, and social relations. And arrayed across this surface is their story, albeit a fragmented one, of a community. And so the list of names are traditional features of Western memorial. But given our archive, we had to reimagine social relations and rehumanize the experiences of the enslaved. And as a result, visitors engage Henry, Isabella Gibbons, Jane, Jack, Roberti, and Randall as families of sisters, grandmothers, uncles, and friends, as workers who took pride in their work as woodcutters, janitors, laundresses, servants, and fiddlers. So carved into the granite, we placed 4,000 memory marks that record the violence of the erasure of the names. And these marks speak back, sometimes with tears, to their descendants and to us. The memory mark holds the possibility of descendants connecting to their family, which indeed happened in January of 2021 with the inscriptions of additional names of members of Thrimston Hearn's family. So the community names appear across from a bench with a timeline, right? Because you have to have a time and dates. That's part of the Western monument form. And so there's a timeline and a water feature that captures the attention of visitors who learn a very different history of the university. Now, in contrast to the wall of marks and names, which rises and inclines outward, a shallow, near-level water table shares with visitors the history of enslavement at the university. The 70 historical entries inscribed into the water table begins with the arrival of the enslaved to Virginia in 1619. The timeline ends with the passing of Isabella Gibbons in 1890. The timeline covers the arrival of 10 enslaved laborers to clear the land that would become UVA in 1817, and it covers a history of transactions, work, regulation, and violence. So when the university's Board of Visitors imagined a historical timeline, they envisioned that it would contain entries following the larger campus-wide commemorative tradition proselytizing Jefferson's democratic values. However, much to their chagrin, which got the design team and our collaborators at the university in a bit of hot water, we created a timeline that really centered the experience of the enslaved community. So, for example, these are some of the timeline. 1850, 3 students attack a 12-year-old enslaved girl in a field near UVA. The students are expelled. 1850, 93 enslaved African Americans live and work at the university. 42 are held by professors, 37 by hotel keepers, and 14 by UVA. 1852, a young man named Charles whitewashes dormitory rooms and cleans lecture rooms. 1853, Isabella Gibbons, a cook who works in a pavilion kitchen, marries William Gibbons, a butler enslaved by another UVA professor. They teach themselves to read and write. A steady stream of water, as you see on the right, washes over the entire arc of the timeline, referencing libation rituals and the currents of rivers that carried people northward to freedom. Now, Isabella Gibbons is the only member of the enslaved community from which the archives have yielded a full name, first and last, a date of death, 1890, a photograph, as I shared earlier, and a brief written record of her experiences, the letter. She serves as a witness in her community, and her remembrance, published in the Freedmen's Record, concludes the historical timeline. So here we see the can we forget. Now, as we were designing the placement of some figural representation on the exterior of the memorial, we became intrigued by the powerful artistry of Eto Otetigbe, and in particular his explorations of scarring and scarification. For Africans and African Americans, the scar can either be a trace of violence, of a whip, or a mark of beauty and belonging, of ritualistic scarification. In his work, Becoming Visible, Eyes on Me, Looking Out, Looking Up, Eto's meditation on Blackness shows how it marks him and Trayvon Martin as simultaneously hypervisible, dangerous, and invisible, not human. And so his kind of marking of the surface in these two works sort of show how, as you move, you can see him, not see him. He can see you, not see you. So that stable, unstable perception of lenticular technique that flickers between appearance and disappearance also evades legibility and hence knowability. And so we invited Eto to join the team and create an artwork for the memorial's outward facing surface. So Eto became interested in layering the information that we had gleaned from conversations and historical sites and archives, such as rare photographs of people like Isabella Gibbons, enslaved at UVA. He also took interest in the rough tombstones like this one on the right, found at the Daughter of Zion African American Burial Ground, and things like vertical quarry marks in stones that would have been worked away by skilled masons like Thurmston Hearn. These traces mark the presence of Black labor that is typically rendered invisible or veiled, right, by their Blackness and the ways in which it disappears, especially the labor of Black women like Gibbons, whose subjectivity, as Horton Spiller reminds us, invokes an impossibility of representation and being in the ontology and the epistemology of the West, right? So that problem of visibility is very real, and that is exactly how this enslaved community just disappeared from any record at UVA. Now, to realize his relief image of Isabella Gibbons' eyes in the granite, Eto and the design team had to develop a unique process and customized software with our Madison, Wisconsin-based fabricator, Cora Stone. And so the intensity of data was translated from a photograph of Gibbons' eyes into a virtual model, then into a machine toolpath that created a virtual surface that was then overlaid onto a digital model of the memorial's curved surface, because the surface is actually parabolic. So it was a very, very complex calculation. And all of this took place digitally, working with remote teams that included UVA's Office of the Architect and our contractor, Team Henry, based in Richmond. And all of this had to be done before cutting into the stone. And you could see in this image that there's the image of the eyes, there's the vertical lenticular marking, and then there's like a bush hammering of the surface of it, right? And so all of that is sort of overlaid together onto the surface of the memorial, the outer surface of the memorial. So, carved out of the Virginia Mist granite by a computerized fabrication process, rather than figured in molten bronze like the Jefferson statue, we see here Isabella Gibbons' eyes. So as visitors approach the memorial from many different directions, her eyes appear or disappear based on the mood of the sky and the approach of the body. And so we enlisted Gibbons as a witness for and the watcher of her community, bringing together their lives, known and unknown, to ours, right? And so seen here, we have this amazing photographer, UVA's photographer, Sandy Suchak, who took many of these, the sun is hitting it at an angle so that you can actually see her eyes sort of appear on the surface. And so she's the witness and watcher. Now, the dedication for the memorial was scheduled to take place in early April, 2 years ago, 2020. But like life for everyone, COVID preempted a formal gathering. In June of 2020, when the construction crews removed the construction fence because they put down sod, the memorial was informally dedicated. The medical school's White Coats for Black Lives organized a protest at the site. The group of doctors and medical students took the knee for 8 minutes and 49 seconds in remembrance of the murder of George Floyd, a gruesome reminder of the violence and injustices that persist in slavery's wake. Now, Gibbons understood the grand story, that is history, as always already weaponized against the African in the Americas. That is why she wrote down and published her recollection of slavery. The terror of white supremacy that Gibbons recalled was not unique, nor was it confined to the institution of slavery. She knew, Jefferson knew, we all know, The Memorial for Enslaved Laborers at UVA came into fruition through a collective desire to face the past, to reckon with the truths, including the horrible cruelties, as Gibbons' quote on the timeline describes. If there were any repairs, so to speak, it was the reunions of descendants with their ancestors who lived, worked, and died on the grounds of UVA. And that was an important part that emerged in the process of working on the memorial, was a descendant community. When Thomas Jefferson died in 1826, his family sold off the enslaved who were there because he was deeply in debt. And so many of those, or some of the enslaved, were actually purchased by professors at UVA. So they ended up, some of those, the enslaved, were actually part of the descendant community of Monticello. And so there are many people still living in Charlottesville who are discovering that they actually are the descendants of this enslaved community. And so there's a genealogist, Shelley, I'm completely blanking on her last name, who's been working with the descendant community. And that's been important because that group has actually formed a nonprofit. And I think that is actually an important outcome, perhaps even more important, I think, than a memorial, because I think that they can then sort of hold the university accountable, and that's actually quite important. So for us, the memorial form, a representational medium of monumentality signifying whiteness, masculinity, and the state, had to be dematerialized to make a space of communion and community. We strove to create a memorial that abandoned grand stories, but instead employed different modes of mark making to tell and to not tell, situated and fragmented narratives of a community's loss, its perseverance, and its possibility for those who gather and seek to remember. Thank you.
Mabel, thank you so very much for your wonderful presentation. So we're going to open it up for question and answer. For the audience, please put your questions into the Q&A feature there at the bottom of the screen. I'll start you off with one just to get the ball rolling here. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the actual selection of the site on campus for the permanent memorial, what the different issues arose about the site selection, and just how that decision was made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a really pertinent question. When we were hired, because it's a state university, they had to do a request for qualifications, then a request for RFP, request for proposals. And for the RFP, Mejan and Eric put together a team of me, Frank, and Greg. As I said, Eto came on a year later. We didn't really understand at the time, but kind of found out when we did the interview that UVA hadn't quite figured out what they needed. So normally when you get hired by a client, there's a program, there's a site, there's a budget. Like that work's been done, right? You're being hired to do a scope of work, right? Interestingly enough, they didn't have a scope of work. They had no site and they had no budget. And so for an architect, that's either a dream or your worst nightmare, right? Because it's a difficult project. The lawn is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Many of you know UVA's aesthetic is very traditional. So when they hired us, we were somewhat, and also the other 4 teams that they had interviewed were all landscape firms, and Mejan and Eric are architects, and we, Greg is a landscape architect, but it was, we weren't the type of team I think that they thought they initially wanted, but they went with us, I think, because we just said, we'll help you ask the questions to figure out those things like site. So when we started, we suggested and worked with them and kind of figured out 3 potential sites. The site that we were on, that was called the Triangle of Grass, and that sort of borders University Avenue and what's called the Corner, and that's a street that goes right into downtown Charlottesville. The other one was an area in front of the library, and that was a site where there had been an anatomical theater designed by Thomas Jefferson, and it's the only building, it's curious, that Jefferson had designed, built by enslaved labor, and that was torn down. So that was a possible site. It was a busy site where a lot of students went. And there were two sites at the end of pavilions 9 and 10. So there were these garden sites at the end. And so it was a kind of double site, And so we developed schemes for all three of those sites. We did a community meeting. We got feedback, came back, consolidated, did another round, came up with 3 different examples that we thought would work, and realized that that site for the triangle of grass was going to be the best one, because it actually was the one that was kind of, even though it was part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site, it was bordering the edge of the university, and then could be accessible by community, folks in the community. And that was important because one of the things that we heard from the surveys and in our different dialogues, public dialogues, dinners, meetings with folks, was that Black Charlottesvillians don't feel very comfortable coming into the lawn, for example, coming into campus. And so, the siting was enough on the kind of edge that allowed it to both be visible and accessible and a reminder, right, of that. And then the other thing, the site was big. It was a big lawn, and surprisingly, there wasn't much there. And so it allowed us to do something of a kind of large scale that we could construct. And so it got approved by the Board of Visitors in June of 2017. We started in October 2016, so we didn't have a lot of time to come up with a design. So we had to really work quickly. But fortunately, it was approved before all hell broke loose in August of 2017. So, but that also, we didn't have any other community. We were scheduled to have some community meetings in the fall of 2017, but because people were very traumatized by all of that, we postponed those meetings until the winter of 2017. So it was a very complicated commemorative landscape and community to work within, I would say.
Sure. So our next audience question is, what lessons learned from the UVA project could you pass to Roanoke College as they work to address their own history through a memorial?
I think it's important to have many voices on as part of and it takes a while. I think what we were fortunate to have was something called the President's Commission to Study Slavery at the University, the PCSU, that was put together. It was head by Marcus Martin, who was a member of the medical faculty, and Kurt Von Dack, who was a historian, and I think a vice dean or something like that. And so that was a committee of students, alumni, faculty, staff, and Charlottesville residents. So there was a spectrum of people, and they were doing all kinds of work, like studying the history, working with archaeologists and historians, going through special collections, getting that stuff, producing a map, so that people could learn this history and develop an understanding of it. So it was a process of getting people to understand what that was. And so publishing a map of a tour of a history of the lawn and of people, they were, Marcus and the committee worked on getting a building named after somebody who had been enslaved. So, it was a way of marking, the discovery of the enslaved burial ground was also really important because that then brought community people together. So there were many things that were, so when we came in 2016, a lot of this had already unfolded. And I should say that this happened because students made it happen. University didn't just decide to do this. That students were an integral part, and they were the catalyst for it, and stayed involved throughout the whole thing. And so that was really, really, really important. So part of it was bringing together people, from all of these different groups. And I think the biggest thing that we were very pleased with, and this was when the Board of Visitors approved, that we were able to get community members to engage the university, because there was a lot of animosity there and a lot of mistrust and distrust, and deservedly so, because they didn't believe the university would ever do anything. And so, a lot of it was just continually working, to build dialogue and to build trust. And so a lot of it is listening, and really making sure that people feel like they're being heard. Like we did all of this. We opened the dialogue. We met with people. We had about, I don't know, maybe 3-4 meetings. We had the survey. We had a conversation with alumni in Washington, D.C. All of that before we put pen to paper, before we even designed anything. So that was really, really important. And I think it was important. I think we got the job because some of the other teams, probably had a much more preconceived idea of what should happen. And we said, we don't know, but we're going to help you find out. And so we thought that was important. So we became part of the ways in which the university was sort of figuring this out, because it's it's a challenging topic, and there's a lot that's just not known.
Yeah. Sort of related to that, our next question is, could you share how people in the community have reacted to this project, both from the university community and the larger Charlottesville community?
Yeah, no, really great question. It's hard to know, one, because I'm not in Charlottesville. I wish, I knew. I've seen it once, actually. I came down I wanted to see it shortly after it was finished, because we couldn't do the dedication ceremony. So I've only been there once. I went for a weekend in June of 2020. Everything was still pretty much on lockdown. So it was still a bit unnerving to even be traveling, because nobody was vaccinated. And so I haven't really had a chance to, I really can't gauge what that has been. I know, my sense is that, the university has developed a whole program for students and how they learn about this history. The university guides that now give tours. This is now, there isn't a separate tour for the history of slavery. It's all part of the tour of the grounds. I know the educational school has come up with, like a K through 12 curriculum. And, like I said, the fact that the descendant community has formed a nonprofit and has been doing things and developing programming has been really important, because they've claimed ownership of it. And, to the point where, we've had to, as we ended, and sort of, there were just the last few things like landscaping, we met with them, they had a request, and we honored their request, right? Because they claimed, that this is honoring their descendants, their families. And so, that's been really important for now to have this group have a presence at the university that had been invisible, essentially.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship that we have with Western monuments. So for example, you referred to Confederate statues and Confederate monuments as being American monuments,
Mm-hmm.
and that this is about a larger production of territorial claims and whiteness.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about where you ended up in some of those conversations after this new memorial at UVA was finished. Like, do you see this as creating new space for a new set of design principles, or are we still sort of locked into that, responding to Western monumentality as such?
Mm-hmm. I think, and I'm kind of, I'm thinking it through. I think we're going to end up doing a book maybe on it. And, for me, it's a kind of an intellectual project. I'm doing a whole other kind of more scholarly archival project on slavery in American civic architecture. And, like Jefferson's Virginia State House, for instance. So I'm interested in, as a scholar, how America's civic architecture proclaimed values of freedom and liberty, these incredible values of emergent liberal democracy of the Enlightenment, and yet were built by enslaved labor. How do you deal with that paradox, right? And then, the ways in which classicism and classical ideas around democracy are mobilized to claim and construct a kind of origin right? A lineage, to ancient, the values of ancient, ancient Greece, the imperialism of ancient Rome, and that tradition of monument making, of the figure and the dates and the, that is kind of where it's coming from, and part and parcel of the creation of that is the idea of just history and the ways in which, as Michelle Roth-Triot reminds us, history is produced. You have to, there's what happens and then there's what is said to have happened, and those aren't the same thing. And so the recording of the event, the construction of the archive, the use of the archive, the writing of the history, and the reception, all of that stuff is the production of the historical narrative. And when you're not seen as historical, or even within, as Hegel would say, the theater of history, right? Because the African has no history, then what do? You're not in the archive. You're completely erased. And, that is why, and I write this and begin with the past, when the Smithsonian, and this is a kind of crazy thing, when the Smithsonian wanted to build the museum to the American Indian, it had a problem of excess. It had collected everything through the process of manifest destiny going westward to basically render Native Americans as a degenerating civilization, and they're dead, they're dying, right? So they had an excess, and so they built a museum. The exact opposite was true for the African in the United States, because there was this consistent, well, there's nothing of historical value to collect. So there was nothing in the archive, right? So the brilliance of that, the African American Museum and Lonnie Bunch and that his Kinshasa Conwell, was they built an archive at the same time they built a building. And they're busily collecting and finding things and trying to get people to come forward, to give us things from Sojourner Truth and Nat Turner and all of this stuff, right? And so I think that, the archives are not, that's the silence of the archives. They're not equal. And so when you're asked to build a monument or a memorial to something that has been rendered absent, that's a challenge, right? And I think that has to be questioned at the same time that one is offering, trying to do this. And this is why it was like, well, what are we going to do about these 4,000 people, right? The 3,111 people that, we don't know, but we knew we had to present that community. And so that's why we put the marks. And they're marks because it's partially a gash, right? It's a mark of violence, of the erasure, but also it's a line that could have the promise of the name actually being recorded, right? And that was the duality that we tried to capture in the project. But it's complicated, and I think every context will be complicated. But I think this is, dealing with the archive of slavery. That's why Saidiya's, work is so important, or the work of Norbesi Phillips and her work on Zong, and the ways in which she deals with, the document of the Zong's event in the archive.
Let's invite our audience that if they want to do any more questions there in the Q&A. And while they're thinking about a last final question, I was just curious if you want to talk a little bit more about that last concept of the archive. There's one of the things that really stood out to me in your remarks was that it really did feel like you were generating a new archive, one that was really informed by conversations with the community and descending communities that were emerging and finding new information and producing new content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the things that I have learned, over the years, sort of working on this question of memory, history, monuments, is, that a lot of times it's just not there. And so the work is that you have to really work to construct what that's going to be. Another sort of parallel example, very, very different moment. As Justine mentioned, I co-curated a show with Sean Anderson called Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America. And this was at the Museum of Modern Art. Well, turned out in the famous Architecture and Design Archive, the only one, the first one in the world to collect architecture and specifically dedicated to modern architecture and design, founded by Alfred Barr, the founder of the museum, and Philip Johnson, there was nothing in the entire archive by a Black person, just absent, erased. And so I've written a piece on that called White by Design, and thinking about the kind of whiteness of the architectural archive. But also, then how do you curate a show? Because in museums like MoMA, the exhibitions are always archival. They're always referencing back to something of modernism, whether it's a painting or film. It's always like the viewer, when they come into the museum, they're situating it. So we kind of put together an advisory group. We made a human archive that could then advise us on thinking through these issues, because there was nothing in the archive to help us sort of figure it out, right? And I think that can be a way of giving voice to the silences in the archive, right? And I'm discovering, just in, again, as I reflect on these experiences, that this has very much been a part of, both a scholarly and creative practice.
Mabel, I want to thank you again so very much. At a personal level, as I mentioned before we started today, I've visited the Charlottesville Memorial about 4 or 5 times, and I do encourage everybody on the call tonight, if you haven't been there, to do it as soon as you possibly can, because it really is an important and moving experience. So thank you both for your wonderful presentation, as well as for taking time to answer all of our questions this evening. Thanks also to the members of our audience for attending and asking thoughtful questions. I just want to add 2 final notes of appreciation, both to the team at Creative Time, Justine Ludwig, Natasha Logan, and Lizzie Smith, for helping to organize this event, and both Lacey Leonard and Tanya Ridpath here at Roanoke College for coordinating all of the logistics. The next lecture in our series will be next Wednesday, April the 6th at 7 p.m. We will have a webinar with Dr. Whitney Battle-Baptiste, Director of the W.E.B. Du Bois Center and Professor of Anthropology at UMass Amherst. And she will give the keynote lecture for our Emancipation Week presentation. If anybody wants to borrow my copy of W.E.B. Du Bois's data portraits, both our guest this evening and our guest next week had a large.
It's a really great. Whitney's phenomenal. Definitely tune into that. She is really great.
And feel free to join us as well for next week's webinar. So that's 7 p.m. April 6th. And to everybody who came in tonight, thank you so much for being here, and I do hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me.
Of course.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you, Tom.